Hello, and welcome back to another Trek Talk Tuesday here on Classic Comics. This week, I'm going to be taking a look at The Man Trap. I believe this was the fifth episode or sixth episode of Star Trek, if you include the cage. All right, and I will be covering this episode in depth. So let's talk about it here for a little while. Now, The Man Trap, of course, was the first episode that was aired on broadcast television. Now, this came after the filming of the second pilot, where No Man Has Gone Before, and after that, the series was picked up by the network. Now, I'm going to be reading excerpts from These Are the Voyages by Mark Cushman. This book gives several behind the scenes looks at some of the episodes. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Okay, here we go. So on March 22nd, 1966, Ed Pearlstein of Desilu Business Affairs sent a certified letter to William Shatner reading, Dear Bill, this is to advise you the Star Trek series has been sold and that we intend to commence production on or about May 23rd, 1966, and that we require your service on or about that date. It was exceptionally good news, albeit expressed in a very understated way. Leonard Nimoy was sent a similar letter of this type, as was George Takei. No one else who appeared in the second pilot film was. Roddenberry, after discussions with both the studio financial officers and the network, had decided to make some cast changes, including that of the ship's doctor. And let me bring that up there. All right, and that brings us to DeForest Kelley. So DeForest Kelley did not play the ship's doctor, of course, in the cage or in where no man has gone before. DeForest Kelley was born in Atlanta and got a taste for show business when singing in the choir of a Baptist church where his father was a minister. It was a strict upbringing, with Kelley describing his father's sermons as earthquakes of fire and brimstone. Then adding, My father believed sincerely that smoking, drinking, dancing, and going to the movies were all sinful. At 17, Kelley was itching to smoke, drink, and dance and go to the movies. He was also yearning to get out of Georgia. He traveled to California to visit an uncle in Long Beach, and this led to a decision to give up his earlier notion of one day becoming, ironically, a doctor. He now preferred to be an actor. Kelley gave his father the bad news, later saying, quote, When I told him I had decided to be an actor, he was sure my soul was lost forever. So he tried to get on with Paramount Studios at one point, where he was considered for a role, but he wound up not getting that. He then had a few bit parts here and there, but then World War II started, and he wound up being drafted. And Kelley, while he was in the military, he wound up actually appearing in several military training films. You may remember Kelley in in such entertaining films as How to Clean Your Gun and How to Active Captured. Now, among others, he was in a film called Time to Kill, which was made for the Navy and released in theaters in 1945. Now, I don't know what this movie was about, but it was seen by a guy who worked at Paramount named Bill Michael John. I guess that's how you say his name. And he is the guy who had actually almost cast DeForest Kelley in a role years earlier before the war had started. So we saw Kelley, he remembered him. and he actually extended an offer to him to come and be an actor with Paramount, because back in those days this was in the old studio system. They would sign a actor to a contract at a particular studio for several years. Kelley was discharged in January of 1946 and soon after signed with Paramount. So he did bit parts for a few years. I'm not going to go into DeForest Kelley's whole resume because he has a long, long history in Hollywood before he ever was on Star Trek, and I can't, there's no time to cover everything. But by the early, maybe mid 50s, his career was going pretty well. He was doing lots of mostly guest roles, doing lots of westerns, particularly. He tended to play villains. He played a lot of villains in TV westerns and also in movies. One of his more profile film roles was he was in OK Corral, which was one of the many movies made about the gunfight at the OK Corral between the Earps and the Clanton gang. He played Morgan Earp in that film alongside Kirk Douglas and a few other folks. And again, I'll read from Mark Cushman's book here. With all the high profile guest shots, Kelley was now a familiar face in television. William Dozier and Robert Sparks of Screen Gems were well aware of his recognition factor and believed he might do well to play Jake Ehrlich, the San Francisco defense attorney who had written a dozen books on law and who was the model for Earl Stanley Gardner's character of Perry Mason. So this is the guy that Perry Mason was based on, I guess. A pilot film based on Ehrlich was about to be made, and Screen Gems recommended Kelley to the writer producer that they had on the assignment. The actor recalled, I walked up this little flight of stairs and into a tiny office with a desk, and there was this bear of a man sitting there. So we had a long talk about this particular show, and he told me, we have no trouble with you. We'll take you to San Francisco and have you meet Jake Ehrlich, who you're going to portray, this famous lawyer. The bear of a man was Gene Roddenberry, and the pilot was a show called 333 Montgomery Street. The pilot received a test airing as an episode of Alcoa Theater. The critic for Daily Variety on June 15, 1960, praised the production in general. Then, in regard to its star, the Daily Variety wrote, a strong argument which may weigh in favor of a series is the central character, as delineated by DeForest Kelley. He makes him human and creditable, out of court, and vivid when defending a client. Okay. Of course, he wound up being brought on and given the role of Dr. McCoy on Star Trek. Shatner said, I remember being in the office at Star Trek with Dee and Bob Jessman the first day. I recognized him from Rain Tree Country. I was an admirer of his work. Leonard Nimoy said, I remember meeting him and was delighted because I knew his work and I knew the role he was going to play. I felt very good about it. I thought he was a very good choice. Uh, James Doohan said, I was very glad that Gene brought DeForest on board. In terms of acting, DeForest was far superior to the man who had played the Doctor in the second pilot. Ooh, shots fired there. Kelley, who was 46 at the time, was guaranteed 7 episodes of Star Trek's initial order of 16. He recalled telling his wife, Carolyn, who remained encouraging and pointed out that those 7 shows would pay the mortgage for a couple of months. Kelley responded, I just hope it goes for 7 episodes. And also at this time, Grace Lee Whitney was brought on board as Janice Rand, the captain's yeoman. She was 35 at the time, a former stage dancer with more than 3 dozen credits in television and film. She had recently played a lead role in Controlled Experiments, the only comedic episode of The Outer Limits. Whitney had met Roddenberry on The Lieutenant, Roddenberry's previous show. When Gene beamed me aboard, I was thrilled, Whitney said much later. I didn't fully realize it at the time, but my life had just taken a sharp turn in a new direction. The sharp turn brought about a fair amount of rumors. The suggestion that Roddenberry put me in Star Trek because of a personal relationship is flatly false, Whitney insisted. I never had a romantic relationship with Gene. Roddenberry, with Gene Roddenberry before Star Trek, during Star Trek, or after Star Trek. Did Gene make passes at me? You better believe he did. Passes, innuendos, double entendres, the whole 9 yards, but I wanted to keep our relationship on a professional basis. Okay, and then James Doohan. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Shatner and Nimoy and George Takei all got offers to come back for the regular series. But James Doohan, who was in the Where No Man Has Gone Before, did not get that letter because he initially was not going to be kept on the show. Let's see. Okay, here he is. Doohan had created the character of Montgomery Scott, a name he chose for Where No Man Has Gone Before. He was happy that the pilot was sold and said, I thought, oh, great, I have a running job here. And if Doohan had been willing to stand up to life's challenges, however, Scotty never would have made it back into space. His contract was for 9 shows, but a few days after signing, he received a letter from Gene Roddenberry. In his memoirs, Beam Me Up Scotty, Doohan recalled receiving a letter reading, thanks very much, but we don't really think we're going to need an engineer. Roddenberry was nowhere near that crass, but the end result would have been the same. The actual letter from Roddenberry that was sent to Doohan on April 11th of 1966 read, Dear Jim, as you probably know, Star Trek will be on the air this coming September. Due to changes in format, budget, and character concepts, we cannot pick up a number of options, including yours, but we do hope that Engineering Officer Scott will reappear in future stories. We hope we'll be fortunate enough to find you interested and available at that time. Basically, don't call us, we'll call you. Doohan was remarkably busy making the rounds as a guest performance, and he didn't need Star Trek, but he did want it. Doohan says, There's a danger in doing a series in that you can get typed. You don't say, Jimmy. You don't say. If the show hits and the role is noticeable, they may never again see you as anyone but other than that one character. All right, but at the same time, you can only count on so many years at finding guest work. Sooner or later, that runs its course. So it comes down to whether or not the role in a series is worth the gamble. I saw the potential of science fiction if it was done properly, and I saw the potential of this role. I felt it was worth fighting for, and any good Scotsman is not afraid of a proper fight. Doohan called his agent, who went to Roddenberry and Solo. A compromise was reached, and Doohan was given a new contract for 5 out of 13 episodes. And with that, there was only one final regular series regular to lock in. That was George Takei. His character was changed from astrophysicist to helmsman. According to Takei, Roddenberry and the network people liked the idea of an interracial cast and had expressed interest in making Sulu more visible. His contract also promised 7 out of the first 16 episodes. Okay, so let's talk about the man trap itself. So, the man trap, as I said, this was the, I believe, fifth episode to be produced. But I'm going with it. Oh, hey, Adega. Good to see you. Thanks for stopping by, sir, as always. Always appreciate it when you stop by. Thank you. So, the Man Trap, it was the fifth produced, but it was the first one to air. Again, as I said earlier, I think maybe because they thought the sort of monster of the week style plot would probably grab people better, I'm guessing. Now, this episode was directed by a guy named Mark Daniels, and Mark Daniels would go on to direct 14 episodes of Star Trek. And he would be tied with another director, Joseph Pevney, at 14 episodes apiece. And those two would each direct twice as many episodes of Star Trek than any other director. Most of the directors that they had in these early episodes didn't come back because they struggled, I guess, with the format and getting things done on time. Okay, so now I'm going to read. This is from TV Guide of September 8th, 1966. Uh, Star Trek, this science fiction series centers on the crew of the USS Enterprise as they travel on an extended space patrol. Tonight, the Enterprise stops on planet M113 for the annual medical checkup of archaeologists Bob and Nancy Crater, but Nancy doesn't seem herself. Nancy is an old flame of Leonard McCoy, and the good doctor's eyes now seem to be clouded by past fondness. As Captain Kirk struggles with growing doubts concerning his chief medical officer's judgment, a member of the landing party suddenly dies under mysterious circumstances. All McCoy can tell Kirk is that the crewmen, the first of many to die in the story, all had the salt instantly depleted from their body. Able to change its form and appear as various crew members, the chameleon like alien beams up to a new feeding ground, the Starship Enterprise. The man trap is a study in loneliness. This is not a simple man against beast tale, but more so man against himself. The message, the mind believes what it wants to. If not, the heart certainly will. On the surface, the man trap appears to be a mere monster story, but the theme of loneliness is handled in a way not before seen on television. Because the monster takes on the image of that one woman from his past, McCoy is distracted from his duty. Beyond this, Professor Crater lost his wife. He admits that he almost destroyed the creature when it killed Nancy. Had he given in to his impulse to kill, he would have been completely alone. Instead, he chose to allow the creature to replace the woman he had loved. Nancy lives in my dreams, Crater says, and it becomes her for me. It doesn't trick me. It needs love too. With this, the man trap is elevated above a standard monster tale. And there are many standout moments in this episode. The speech in the briefing room about the creature being the last of its kind, nearly extinct, like the buffalo, is one. Another is Crater's confession that he transferred his love for his wife to the creature, so much so that he can't really even clearly remember the date of his wife's death. The Man Trap is a personal story for McCoy and contains elements of mystery, suspense, horror, and action adventure. It provides us with a tour of the Enterprise and does a splendid job of introducing many of the main characters. And to NBC's pleasure, it delivered on that bold speech made by Kirk at the start of each episode about exploring strange new worlds. One reason why the network approved this as the lead off for the series. Okay, so let's talk about the episode itself and get into this. So again, since this is a the first episode that aired, red shirt mosh pit. Yeah, a lot of red shirts give their lives for this episode, don't they? So the Enterprise is stopping at planet M113 to perform annual checkups on Professor Crater, an archaeologist, and his wife Nancy Crater, who is of course an old flame of Dr. McCoy. Now it's interesting that they chose this episode as being sort of representative for the series, because that's kind of what you want in the pilot, so to speak. Although technically this isn't the pilot, but you want to kind of give a representation of what the show's about. But this episode is interesting because it's very McCoy centric, which most episodes aren't, of course. And also, compared to most episodes, Spock's role is kind of light in this one, particularly like in the first half. He becomes more important in the second half, but in the first half of this episode, he's really not in it much. And so they beam down to the planet, and the whole premise is established very quickly. Right away, we discover that the different characters are seeing a different woman. Boy, of course, sees Nancy much as he remembers her, while Kirk is seeing an older, woman with gray hair. And of course, there's Crewman. What's this guy's name? Darnell, Crewman Darnell, of course, sees this hot chick that he mentions like seeing on a pleasure planet previously. So basically, seeing like a prostitute, maybe. I mean, that's kind of the implication. And McCoy takes offense at Darnell leering at his old girlfriend, and so gets testy about it. McCoy suggests that maybe Darnell ought to step outside. He does. Then Nancy says, I'll go find my husband. But instead of finding her husband, she lures crewman Darnell away. And I tell you, she's not subtle. This scene's kind of funny because you almost expect some kind of sexy music like "Bow, wow, 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 wow" to be playing during this scene. But she lures Darnell away, and then Crater comes to their dwelling, and he protests their presence immediately, making it clear they aren't wanted there, and says they just need their salt supplies replenished. And other than that, he just wants them to leave. But McCoy insists on the checkups because it is by the book and is required and all that. But then they hear Nancy screaming. They come to find crewman Darnell dead with these curious ring like spots on his face. And Nancy says that she saw him handling a plant called a Borgia plant. And Kirk finds some of the Borgia plant in his mouth. This, of course, all suggesting that he tried to eat the plant and was killed when he was poisoned. McCoy is now a bit puzzled because he's now seeing Nancy as an older woman like Kirk is, and he's a bit befuddled by that. But they decide to forego the examinations in light of Darnell's death and resume the examinations tomorrow. Meanwhile, up on the ship, Spock is in charge, and then we have this amusing scene where Uhura gets very flirtatious with Spock. And of course, he's not reciprocating the flirtation at all. In sickbay, we learn that the Borgia plant causes alkaloid poisoning, but McCoy can't find any evidence of alkaloid poisoning in his system, and he argues that Darnell couldn't have died from ingesting that plant. Something killed him, obviously, but he's at a loss to figure out what it is. But further examination reveals that all the salt has been depleted from Darnell's body. Remembering that Crater had requested additional salt supplies, Kirk becomes suspicious and decides to return to the planet to question Crater and his wife further. Now, when they arrive, Nancy is not around, so Kirk sends crewman Green off to find Nancy, and then sends crewman Sturgeon, and this is Green here, and this is Sturgeon. They send Sturgeon off to collect a sample of the Borgia plant for further testing. And Kirk insists that Crater and Nancy come up to the ship until the hazard that it was caused Darnell's death is better understood. Crater is resistant, and he actually sneaks away while Kirk and McCoy are distracted. Crater finds Sturgeon dead with the ring like marks on his face. And then we see Nancy with crewman Green, who is also dead, also with the ring marks on his face. Crater calls for her, telling her that he has salt for her. Kirk and McCoy arrive, finding Sturgeon's body. They then decide to find Green. And this is one of the scenes that really is kind of puzzling because they've got communicators. So they could just call him, on the communicator, but instead they're content to just stand there yelling Green's name. Green, hello, Green. It's like, dude, you got a communicator. And so does he. Just call him with your communicator. So they beam back up to the ship. Of course, Kirk now has another crewman dead. Nancy shapeshifts and becomes green, and then he joins them up on the ship. And then we get an interesting shot where the camera follows Kirk into the elevator on the ship, and the camera gets up really close in his face. You don't usually see a shot like this on the series. Okay. Now, as I recall, it kind of reminds me of that overhead shot in Where No Man Has Gone Before, where there's a shot from the ceiling down on Kirk and Spock as they're entering the elevator. And kind of like this close up shot, it's a shot you don't see very often. Now, Kirk tells Spock to scan the planet to try and find Nancy. And they can find Crater, but they can't seem to find Nancy. Meanwhile, crewman Green, of course, it's not really green, encounters Yeoman Rand and follows her to the botany lab. Sulu is there, and in the scene, he mentions the great bird of the galaxy. Oh, and also, I forgot to mention, and this is something I overlooked. So back here, where is it? In this scene here, when they find, or no, it's back. Hold on. Okay, so in this scene where they find Darnell dead, this is where we get our very first "He's dead, Jim," as McCoy pronounces Darnell dead. So they didn't waste any time in killing off a crewman. Okay, so again, Green, or the alien imitating Green, goes to the botany lab and he sees the salt on Sulu's lunch tray and is tempted by it. But then this plant here, this sort of sentient plant, or begins making some weird noises. It starts freaking out, and Green is spooked by it, and he flees from sickbay. And of course, this is really just someone's hand sticking up out of this thing with some kind of glove with some kind of fronds on it. But I mean, look, it's the mid '60s. What do you want? They didn't have CGI, and I think animatronics existed at this point, but they were pretty rare, and it probably would have been just too expensive to do this that way. So out in the hallway, he encounters Uhura, or it encounters Uhura, and it transforms again, becoming an African American crewman who then approaches Uhura. And Uhura is initially attracted and seems almost transfixed by the creature. And the creature seems like it's about to possibly feed on Uhura, but they're interrupted by Rand and Sulu coming out of the botany lab. And that sort of snaps Uhura out of her trance, and she hears a message calling her to go to the bridge. So she hops on the elevator, clearly unsettled by what has just happened. Let's see here. Now, they're having no luck finding Nancy. Let's see. Yeah, so Spock tells Kirk that the ship's instruments can't find anyone within 100 miles of Crater, or Crater's dwelling, and Kirk decides that they've got to go back down there and question Crater and get more information. And an interesting thing about this scene is we see Kirk eating up on the bridge. And again, I don't recall any other scene where he's actually eating a meal on the bridge. It's kind of unusual. Now, the creature uh, finds McCoy's quarters and then changes into Nancy again, just in time for McCoy to come out of his quarters and see her. He's stunned to see her, thinking that not thinking or not realizing that this isn't Nancy, of course, and invites her into his quarters. And meanwhile, okay, so let me bring up. Oh, sorry, wrong one. There we go. Meanwhile, Rand and Sulu find another crewman dead with ring marks on his face. Now, in McCoy's quarters, you got to go, Adega. Okay, I understand. Thanks for stopping by anyway. Have a good evening. All right. So where was I? All right. So in McCoy's quarters, now earlier McCoy had been advised by Kirk to take a sedative and try and get some sleep. And so Nancy, of course, tells him that that is a good idea. So he takes a sedative and falls asleep. Then the creature transforms again, appearing like McCoy. Meanwhile, down on the planet, Kirk and Spock confront Crater, who just tells them he doesn't want them there and to go away. Of course, they want to know where his wife is and are, of course, puzzled why he isn't more concerned about his wife's whereabouts. They then stumble upon Green's body from earlier, again with the ring marks on its face, and realize that whatever went up to the ship with them earlier was not Green. So Kirk then calls Sulu and tells him to order a security alert. And then we get some scenes of folks running around the hallways. Now, this is interesting. In this scene, we get a shot of a female crewman, but she's not wearing the mini dress costume that they're usually wearing. She's wearing these shirts and the black pants, just like everybody else is. And also, right after that, we get a shot here of a crewman wearing the sort of brownish or tan turtleneck that was being worn by crewmen in the cage and in Where No Man Has Gone Before. And right after that, we see another crewman wearing one of those blue turtlenecks. Okay, they try to confront Crater, and then this was a pretty good shot here as Crater fires his laser, and it's one of the laser pistols from the cage, and explodes this column here, causing Kirk and Spock both to kind of duck for cover. And there you see the pistol. Meanwhile, up on the Enterprise, McCoy comes to, and of course, it's not really McCoy, comes to the bridge. And again, kind of an interesting shot because we see Sulu sitting at the communications post where Uhura would usually be, while Uhura is over at the science station where Spock would normally be. Okay, now on the planet, Kirk manages to stun Crater and then asks where Nancy is. And of course, here's where we get the big plot twist. Crater reveals the truth about his wife. She died a year or two ago at the hands of the creature that has been masquerading as her. And he says that this creature was once very numerous on the planet, in millions of them, but this is the last of its kind. And he compares it to the buffalo in North America. On the Enterprise, Kirk holds a staff meeting, which is attended by the creature, which is disguised as McCoy. And McCoy argues that the creature is just trying to survive and isn't really a threat. Kirk asks Crater, and this is an interesting point. He asks Crater if Crater can recognize the creature when it's in disguise. And Crater says that he can. He can recognize it even when it's appearing as something else, which is interesting. First of all, how can he do that? But of course, it brings an interesting layer to the scene because if that's the case, then he knows this is the creature sitting right next to him. And he refuses to help Kirk and the crew find the creature and kill it. Now, Spock suggests that they administer truth serum to Crater in order to find out uh, where the creature is hiding. And McCoy takes Crater to the sick bay, and Spock decides he's going to join them when McCoy takes Crater to sick bay. Later, Kirk is called to the sick bay, and Spock mentions that it wasn't McCoy. Obviously, it was really the creature. It tried to feed on him, but his Vulcan physiology wasn't palatable to the creature. So instead, it fed on Crater, killing him, and they find Crater in the other room. Now, interestingly, in this scene, Spock mentions that, quote, his ancestors spawned in a different ocean than Kirk, and his blood cells are different. Now, they don't expressly say that his blood is green or copper based or anything like that as they do later, but if you're have a sharp eye, it's kind of contradictory because there's like this sort of greenish coloring around this wound on his head, which seems to suggest green blood, but then the wound itself is red. Again, it's like they haven't really kind of determined what Spock's alien nature is fully at this point. So the creature flees to McCoy's quarters and awakens McCoy and says, "Oh, Leonard, you have to help me. They want to kill me." And of course, McCoy is baffled about what she's talking about. Then Kirk arrives and is threatening Nancy with a phaser. He then offers her some salt tablets. They then get into a bit of a scuffle. McCoy tries to take the phaser, but then Nancy is able to sort of entrance Kirk or hypnotize him. She then starts to feed on him, and it looks like he's getting a mind meld, actually, kind of. Spock arrives and tells McCoy to shoot Nancy because he's got the phaser. McCoy refuses. Spock then attacks Nancy, who, of course, swats him away. And Spock says, "Look, that can't be Nancy, can it? That's not the Nancy you know." It then reveals itself. And why it then shows itself here at this point is not really clear. I think it would have been better if McCoy had shot the creature first and then it had revealed itself. But of course, this is one of the iconic creatures of Star Trek, the salt sucker. It then starts feeding on Kirk again. And Shatner does a good job of selling it. He's screaming his lungs out. And then finally, McCoy phasers the creature. It then tries to advance on him. He shoots it again, and that kills the creature. And then it finally dies. And as you see, it's got this kind of furry skin here. And subsequently, later on the bridge, Kirk seems kind of distracted, and Spock asks Kirk, if something is troubling him. And Kirk says, "I was just thinking of the buffalo, Mr. Spock." So, a pretty good episode overall. Now, as is often the case with Star Trek episodes, really, the guest stars are the ones that really kind of sell the episode. And Jean Bell, who is the actress that played Nancy, did a pretty good job, I think, of selling her role as a sort of alien vampire. And Alfred Ryder, who played Professor Crater, he was pretty good too. And as you can see, DeForest Kelley, of course, is not part of the uh, the introduction credits yet. He isn't on an equal footing with Nimoy and Shatner yet. That won't happen until season 2. So for now, DeForest Kelley and Grace Lee Whitney are both sort of supporting characters, not regular characters. All right, so let's talk about the episode and how it was received. Now, of course, for this episode, they didn't really know what would happen to someone with certainty if all the salt was sucked out of their body. So Roddenberry contacted a company called DeForest Research. No relation to DeForest Kelley, I assume. And since no person had ever had all the salt removed from their body suddenly, there was no way to know for sure how quickly someone would die. But it was deduced that death would likely occur and would likely occur soon. And yeah, I would say death would be almost instantaneous if you had all the salt removed from your body. At this stage, the creature was never seen as anything other than a salt sucking creature who could put its victim into a hypnotic trance. Roddenberry, before I get to that, so Robert Justman, who was one of the producers, wrote Roddenberry. I don't know what the grotesque biped should look like or how we are to go about handling this creation. I might make a suggestion which goes in an extremely opposite direction. Perhaps the grotesque biped could be an extremely beautiful yet terrifying young lady. Perhaps she could be something along the lines of the green dancing maiden we had in the Star Trek pilot. Would you believe a blue dancing maiden with orange hair and plenty stacked? He asks. I'd like to be in on the casting of this part. Roddenberry agreed that a sexy monster was intriguing, but Stan Robinson had already endorsed the idea of the protagonist being an animal. The question how to get both. George Clayton Johnson was the answer, or had the answer. He later said, my very first Twilight Zone episode, The Four of Us Are Dying, had to do with a person who could change his appearance. I figured something that worked once and succeeded could work again. So I started thinking in terms of a shape changer and came up with the idea of the last of its kind. The idea that at one time there were three, four, five states completely covered by one herd of buffalo, tens of hundreds of thousands of them. And now there are almost none of them left. What if there was only one? That idea appealed to Gene, the idea of this creature being the last of its kind. Okay, so Gene Ball, at the age of 38, was cast to play McCoy's former flame, Nancy Crater. Her work began in TV several years earlier with appearances on, among other series, in the multiple episodes of Perry Mason and Bachelor Father. Alfred Ryder as Professor Crater was a familiar face on TV and in film. He was 50, and among 100 jobs, he'd been in two episodes of The Wild Wild West and one each of The Outer Limits and One Step Beyond. He also played the ghost of a Nazi U-boat captain on Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and the leader of the aliens in the TV series The Invaders. Okay, now the Salt Vampire required some creative casting. And it turns out the person they got to play the Salt Vampire, the person in the suit, was Sandra Gimple. Uh, eh, let's see. And so the director says she was incredible. She got the whole spirit of the thing. For some weird reason, at the end of the show, the creature really did look sad. It had that haunted look, and you thought, oh God, it's like killing a helpless dog or something. And this woman, Sandra Gimple, I believe she's actually was one of the Telosians in the cage, actually. So this was sort of a return to Star Trek for her. Oh, and here's an interesting note. So it was up to the Star Trek prop man, Irving Feinberg, to find salt shakers. And of course, he had to figure out what salt shakers would look like in the future. He scoured Los Angeles shops looking for the perfect salt and pepper set before finding a pair of oddly shaped Swedish plated shakers. Roddenberry, however, rejected them because, as Justman had worried, they looked too unusual to be recognized for what they were. Some sources say that with the addition of a small rotating light in the top, Feinberg turned the shakers into McCoy's pocket scanners. And if that's right, then the doctor uses one in this episode while examining Crater. So let me bring that up. Okay, so we'll have to go back to the beginning here. Here we go. And you see it there. And of course, McCoy uses this device or something like it frequently throughout the series when he's scanning people to determine their health. So, according to the book, this may be, and it says that some sources say this, some sources conflict, but it's possible that those are salt shakers with a light attached to them that McCoy is using. And overall, I think this is a pretty solid episode of Star Trek. Again, I think it's interesting that although this was the first one aired and is supposed to be representative of the series, we get a big focus on McCoy while Spock is comparatively has a comparatively small role in the episode, particularly in the first half. But I do think that the whole episode, the message of this creature being the last of its kind and trying to be somewhat sympathetic towards the creature, I do think that falls very much in line with Star Trek and with its more sort of humane message. Not simply saying that this is a creature that is evil in and of itself and needs to be destroyed, but the episode makes the argument multiple times that this creature is just trying to do what it needs to survive, and it really doesn't have a choice in in what it's doing. All right, anyway, that's all I have to add on the man trap. Now, next week I'll probably switch to going in production order, which means I'll be looking at the Corbomite maneuver, which is the third episode that was produced. And then after that, Mud's Women, and I'll be going in production order from that point on. So before I go, please do like this stream, and please do sub to the channel and check out some of my other videos. And I will be back next week. Until then, take care and have a good evening.